Antarctica was actually a lot greater than I thought. I hadn't actually looked into a map of Antarctica to see where Scott and Shackleton's hut had been. The proposal was to visit the Southern Ocean to experience the vast oceans in the southern southern hemisphere, and visit the huts, the Nimrod hut of Shackleton and the Terra Nova hut of Shackleton. And of course it's on the longest distance you can actually travel to get to Antarctica from New Zealand. It's not the one from the peninsula. So I should have done that beforehand. And of course most of the boats leave from South America to visit the peninsula. Any travel agencies that I phoned, anybody got in touch, didn't touch the Ross Sea or Ross Island. Nobody did it. I eventually managed to find somebody on Christmas Eve who did the actual trip, and I managed to phone up and get a berth upon a boat called the Spirit of Enderby, who travelled down to that part of Antarctica, which was absolutely fantastic. So that's it came about by putting a proposal into the Ferguson Gallery, and they accepted it, which was great. Well, I've always been interested in ice and snow. I've always liked that. I've done a lot of hill walking up in the Cairngorms, and I quite enjoy doing some of the winter walking, not climbing. The other thing I found out as well is my grandparents actually come from Orkney, and their name's Balfour, and that's the place, of course, where the Hudson Bay Company had their headquarters for going to Canada and the Arctic regions up there. So I don't know if there's anything in the genes there. I don't know. I'd have to look into that one. But it's certainly like hill walking and snow and the ice up in the mountains of Scotland. That's certainly part of it. I've always been interested in drawing and painting, and I came across a painting that I did in first year when I was in school, and it looks remarkably like a drawing I did 40 years later, which is a little bit worrying. I've also got paintings of birds. I'm interested in wildlife and wild places, and I've also got a painting of a couple of what looks like seagulls. I don't know why they'd be seagulls exactly, but I've got a couple of paintings of seagulls, and I've got a little problem drawing the beaks and stuff in first year. And I did a drawing in Antarctica of albatross, and I had a little problem doing the beaks 40 years afterwards, almost exactly the same. I'm not quite sure what that's about. So maybe there is a connection going back there about wild places in the ocean and ships. It's not in the family or anything, but there might be something there. Maybe. Just before I went to Antarctica, nobody had mentioned Antarctica as a subject matter. Well, for a couple of years in Edinburgh, I've never seen one exhibition about Antarctica. There'll probably be one up at the gallery about somebody called William Spears Bruce, which I'd missed, and it was the anniversary of him going to Antarctica in 1904. He's a famous Scottish Antarctic explorer or scientist. And just when I learned that I was going to Antarctica, I'd won the J.D. Ferguson, I'd managed to book my place in the boat. That part of it was kind of sorted. 2 exhibitions cropped up in Edinburgh of people who'd been to Antarctica, which I thought was very strange. So I went to those exhibitions, and they were beautiful, beautiful paintings and drawings of icebergs, of snow-capped mountains, and they were fantastic. Very large paintings as well, triptychs and large square oil paintings, fantastic things. And I thought, if I go to Antarctica, I don't think I can come back and do the same kind of work. I can't come back with paintings and prints and do the same thing. That's how I felt myself. So when I did get there, I was very lucky that I'd obviously gone to a part that these 2 artists hadn't been to. They'd been down via the peninsula, which is 2,000-3,000 miles on the other side of Antarctica. This side of Antarctica, with the Ross Sea and Ross Island, is perhaps, I would say, the most interesting part of Antarctica at the moment, because it's got that historical connection. And when I visited the huts, what you do become aware of is just how basic really the equipment they would have had. Wooden sledges, they would have taken some dogs, ponies, cotton tents. They certainly would have had Burberry outer jackets and so on to keep out the wind, and woolen clothes on the inside. But they certainly took wolf gloves, dog fur gloves, that kind of thing. So the whole idea of travelling 800 miles from Ross Island is 800 miles to get to the South Pole, or 900 miles to get to there. With nothing there, nothing to stop off, and there's no food or anything, there's no wildlife there, it's just ice and snow, so you have to carry everything with you. So the idea of endurance and surviving on your own and being independent is certainly something that interests me. At that time in 1911 and anything before that, it'd be like going to the moon today. You couldn't be rescued in any way. Once you were there, that was it. In winter time, the ice goes all the way out into the Southern Ocean, so it creates a barrier so no other boats can get in. There would be no aeroplanes at the time, so you were literally trapped there. And if the ice hadn't got blown out in the summer of the year afterwards, due to tide and wave and so on, if the ice hadn't been blown out, you could either be trapped there for 2 years, possibly 3 years, and nobody could get to you. And once again, the problem with being in Antarctica is the fact that, except around the coastlines, there's nothing in the interior of Antarctica to feed off, no animals. There were a group of people who got trapped up, it was called the Northern Party. Scott had his expedition to the South Pole, that was his goal, but there were other expeditions from the same place in Ross Island, and some people went north up into Transantarctic mountains, and they got trapped there over the winter, and they dug a snow hole into the side of one of the hills there, and lived there over the winter in the darkness for about 4 months. They'd stocked up on seals, they'd stocked up on penguins to keep them going over that particular time, and they just survived with no more. They had a stock of tinned foods and pemmican and so on, but they had to save that for their sledging party back to Ross Island, so they couldn't tuck into it. You do see a photograph of them 4 or 5 months afterwards, and they're just covered in black suit. To keep warm, they actually burned penguin blubber and seal blubber to keep themselves warm. And obviously the most important thing in Antarctica really is water. You're surrounded by ice, you're surrounded by snow, but what you have to do is melt it. You need fuel for that. When I visited the snow hole on, I think it's called Inaccessible Island, there's a little island there, and there's a little plaque that says where the snow hole is, and there's nothing much else there. Obviously it's just something they carved into the snow, but what there is there still is the skeletons of the animals they'd eaten 100 years on. And what they found later on, when they were starting to run out of meat, one of the parts they didn't touch of the actual animal, of course, was the head. So just further up from where the snow hole was, there's a pile of carcasses, seal carcasses or skeletons now. Because it's so cold, it's kind of preserved them in certain respects. But all the skulls have been stoved in, and afterwards they've taken the brains out to eat once they found out they were quite tasty. So the whole idea of endurance and trying to survive is very interesting, especially on a day where, today, where you can go for a cup of coffee and a scone or a latte just round the corner. So I find that quite interesting. Which took me on to the other part of the work, was trying to work with fur and wood and create little sledges, little full-size fursuits actually, and then I moved on to rockets and spacesuits. To do with Cowdenbeath, of course, just round from Cowdenbeath High School, or Beath High School, there is a little street called Gagarin Way, named after Yuri Gagarin, because that part of Fife was a communist area at one point. So they've named one of their streets Gagarin Way. So I have tried to make a piece to do with Yuri Gagarin as the first man in space. We'll see how that looks when it's in the Loch Gelly Centre. To do it on your own, if you want to go to Antarctica now and put on an expedition there on your own, one, you'd have to be very rich, very wealthy. You'd have to be a celebrity or someone that's done before, like Ranulph Fiennes, for instance, Sir Ranulph Fiennes. Or the other thing that's that we'd want in Antarctica is to be a scientist. If you want to be there as an artist and put on your own expedition there, I think it would be very difficult, once again, unless you were very wealthy. So the way that I did it is I managed to get a berth on a boat called the Spirit of Enderby, which was an ex-Russian icebreaker, something like that, and that had been customised for passengers. And I was on that boat for 4 weeks, which took us down into the Ross Sea and back again in a 4-week time span. So I didn't actually have to, I didn't travel to the South Pole as such. It was really just down to the coast of Antarctica, Cape Adare, and then down through the Ross Sea down to Ross Island and then back again. We visited some subantarctic islands. The crew on board the ship were Russian. The captain was Russian. They still flew the Russian flag when you entered the harbours or territorial waters. And the passengers, there was about 40 or 50 passengers, a very small boat. If you went via the peninsula, the boats are carrying about 300 people, maybe 400 people in the boats from the peninsula. But there's a Antarctic, what's it called? Figure on the Antarctic Treaty, I'll miss that about. Anyway, so I took a boat down there. About 6 or 7 days down to get to Antarctica, then 2 weeks round the Ross Sea, and then back again for a week. It has to be flexible because of the weather, very flexible. So the ships that go down to that part of Antarctica are very small, only 40 or 50 passengers, but no bigger than that. the New Zealand government has stated they want the boats to be as small as that because it's easily managed, and the environmental impact is meant to be very small, especially when you land in the penguin colonies, and the huts themselves only take 2 or 3 people at a time. So once 2 or 3 people have got in the hut, they come out and let another 2 or 3 people into it. So they don't want big crowds down there, which makes it actually quite a nice way to do it. Who knows for the future though, they might, for money, and they might eventually have huge big passenger ships that can take 200-300 people, possibly, who knows, 2,000 people. It could all change, but they are trying to keep it controlled, if you want. When Scott was there, he noted that the glaciers, even at that time, were retreating. The greenhouse effect, or sorry, the warming of the atmosphere has been happening over the past 1,000 years or so. I'm not quite sure the scientific aspect of it is, but it was happening when Scott was there in Shark that they did see it. But I think what has happened is the speed of the ice melting. That's what's I think that's what's troubling people at the moment. So actually trying to preserve what's there is quite difficult because already the behaviour of the penguins has changed. I think certain species of penguin are changing. They're going. Penguins that would have perhaps lived on the subantarctic islands are moving further and further south now. Where I was, it hadn't changed that much. It was still Adelie penguins, king penguins, emperor penguins. So that hadn't changed that much there. But try to preserve it some way. Yeah, it's very important. They did do some kind of survey on Antarctica, and they were trying to find what the biggest impact on Antarctica was in terms of destroying this pristine continent. And obviously you've got the greenhouse effect, there's the ozone layer, that's where they discovered the ozone was disappearing, and various other things. But the biggest impact they felt that was changing Antarctica was the scientists themselves, their bases, and the Americans moving them to military bases. I think, I could be wrong here, in the 50s and so on, I believe they were just bulldozing penguins out of the way so they could build their huts and so on. Any bit of land without ice or snow and so on is good to build huts on. So of course penguins, that's good for them as well for their nest, but humans thought it was good for them as well, so they bulldozed it out. So they are trying to preserve it in some way, yes, because the other thing about Antarctica is they're not quite sure what's there, what's preserved in the ice. I think just recently they found some lake, I think in the Russian sector, which is a mile down below the ice, and there's this lake that's been untouched for millions of years, and they're not quite sure what microbes or what life is in the actual lake itself. So that's why they're trying to keep it pristine as well, because it's basically a large scientific laboratory where human beings haven't been. So they're trying not to touch it because there could be something very important, very valuable there that could help human beings or just help the earth. I'm not sure. Something along those lines. The time in the boat was fantastic. In the proposal, it was to experience what it would be like on a boat or on a ship in a large ocean with no land. We saw no other ships once we cast off from New Zealand, and that was fantastic. The experience of that was very interesting, partly because there was nothing to see. Also, you think the ocean would be teeming with life. There were lots of albatross following the boats, lots of petrels. We occasionally had dolphins at the nose of the boat as we were cruising towards Antarctica, and only once did a pod of whales pass under the boat. In fact, there was 3 or 4 pods of pilot whales passed under the boat just as we went through. But apart from that, there was not a lot going on. And as a passenger, that could have its problems. They wouldn't have much to do. So they'd actually devised it just like a ship, an expedition ship. They devised lectures as we went down there. So we had lectures on penguins, seals, elephant seals, the habitats of the subantarctic islands, the early boats that they used for the expeditions, like the Fram, the Terra Nova and so on. So that was very interesting. Once we got down to Antarctica, that was very good. There are a couple of photographs that I have of a little bit of ice, no bigger than a beach ball, because we thought that's the first piece of ice. So I've got all these photographs of this little bit of ice, and the Russian crew on the boat, of course, were laughing at us. They'd been down on numerous occasions, because eventually, of course, you're seeing lumps of ice at the size of buildings. You're seeing lumps of ice at the size of small towns and cities. They're absolutely massive. Big tabular icebergs that have broken off from the ice barrier and basically sailing out into the Southern Ocean. But that first bit of ice was very exciting. The other thing that was quite exciting as well, which kind of caught us unawares, was what we thought originally were dolphins porpoising out the water just from the boat. But of course they weren't porpoise, they were seals. They were penguins. Hundreds and hundreds of penguins porpoising out the water. And that was very interesting too. So that was pretty fantastic. I think I've got a little bit of film as well, is the boat actually travelling through the ice. So the sounds of Antarctica are quite interesting in a boat. The ice scrapes underneath the ship, and when bad weather kicked in as well, it was being sugared about in your bed, backwards and forwards at night time. So that was very interesting. So it was fantastic. One of the things I would like to have done, I would love to have got off the boat and perhaps gone inland. Little expeditions inland through sledges or boats, sledges or little what you call them, snowcats, that kind of thing, or skis, anything. If we could have camped and gone inland a wee bit, that would have been fantastic. But as it was, we spent all the time in the boat, and we just got little zodiacs that visited the little islands and so on and so forth, which was quite exciting in itself. Getting off the boat was quite incredible, because the swell on the boat, if we were anchored off an island, could be anything between 1 or 2 metres, which is quite a height. And of course, you know, what the boat's actually level with the staircase, and you're jumping in, and the swell disappears, and the next thing you know, it's 2 metres down. So you're jumping 2 metres into the boat. So that side of things was quite exciting. The other thing I quite liked as well, of course, is it wasn't your normal safari, like going to Africa, we see lions and elephants and so on. It was a kind of safari where you were getting the Zodiac onto a sandy shore, and you were kind of walking onto a sandy shore and then surrounded by millions of penguins, or I don't know, hundreds of elephant seals or sea lions or something. So it was that. So the safari, nice wilderness areas in terms of that side of things was fantastic. You weren't meant to approach a penguin, but they're allowed to approach you. So if you were sitting sketching, which I did in the black sands, sort of sketching where the penguins would come up here and peck at your trousers and things to see if you were edible or not. So that side of thing was fantastic. 1 or 2 people got chased by seals, which is quite exciting, especially an elephant seal, which is about 2 or 3 metres long, and that's quite a frightening prospect. Obviously, the staff that were with us, the expedition staff, they were experienced with dealing with them, and all you have to do is put up your hands, or they had a stick or something, and they just kind of waved it about. It was absolutely fine. But if you're not used to it, the elephant seals and seals themselves are carnivores, so when they're shouting and barking at you, it's quite a frightening thing. So, and it was quite funny seeing somebody being chased by a seal, but as long as it wasn't you. So, and because of the vagaries of the weather and the ice and so on, when he was getting a chance, he was trying to fit in everything for us. When we first got to Shackleton's hut at Cape Royds on Ross Island, we couldn't actually land because of the ice, and the captain wouldn't allow the boat to go in far enough because of the ice. It could damage the hull of the ship. So there was this kind of not antagonism, but this kind of the expedition leader wants to land the people because they've paid this money to go there, and the captain obviously wants to be as safe as possible. So the best bits of the actual trip is when we did land and we were allowed just to do not almost our own thing, but just allowed to wander around, take off the life jackets, get your rucksack. And for me, it was sitting down and doing some drawing and sketching and just being there alone, sort of, because you're allowed to walk off on your own in certain parts of the areas. The areas in Antarctica themselves, you're not actually meant to walk out of them. They're areas of scientific interest, but they're kind of cordoned off. You're not meant to go beyond them. But it's a big enough place that you can find a quiet place to do some sketching. The weather was described as benign. When we got down to Ross Island, it was absolutely beautiful. It was beautiful and calm. It was blue sky with a few puffy clouds. In fact, you wouldn't believe it was Antarctica. So sitting out in the black sand, volcanic sand from Mount Erebus, and sketching was some of the best times on one. And it was quite hard to believe you're actually in Antarctica sometimes. Looking out over the Ross Sea, the Transantarctic mountains, they were all glistening in the distance. They were quite far away, 30 miles, 40 miles, but it looked as though you could walk them in half an hour because the air was so clear. Those are perhaps some of the favourite times we did that. Obviously, getting into the huts of Scott and Shackleton, they were fantastic. Once again, because only 1 or 2 people could get into the huts, you were basically having the hut to yourself. So you would experience that kind of ghostly atmosphere of the early expeditions. A lot of the artefacts that belonged to Scott or Shackleton have been taken away, but the integrity of the building, the bunks, sleeping bags, boots, some of the food, the shelves, the layout of the hut, and so on and so forth is pretty much exactly the same as it was left 100 years ago. The other thing we actually visited was something called Borchgrevink, I think. The other hut that we visited was Borchgrevink. He was an explorer before Scott and Shackleton. Not many people have heard of him, but he's the first person to have wintered in Antarctica. And he's got a hut there as well up on Cape Adair, in one of the northern coasts of Antarctica. And his hut is still there. And if you go into there, it's very small. That was pretty fantastic to visit that as well. Partly because I'd never heard of them, I was quite embarrassed about that. And also because it's actually in this penguin colony with about 1 million penguins. The whole area is covered in pink, a kind of pinky colour, and that's basically penguin poo. It's from the krill that the penguins eat. But that was pretty fantastic as well. I enjoyed that, partly because it was a surprise. I wasn't expecting to see that. When we were on Ross Island in around about Shackleton, it was above freezing. In fact, 2 years ago, I think it was colder here than it was in Antarctica. It was when that big cold spell went in. However, of course, when the temperature did drop, it was very cold, especially around Franklin Island. It was certainly below freezing there, minus 10, minus 15. But like I say, it was probably colder here at the time. But the sun was shining. The temperature does get above freezing in Antarctica. The snow and ice does melt. And that's why I went at that time of the year, because it was the summer. It was the summer in Antarctica. And it allows the boats to get so far down south. And that's why Scott and Shackleton chose that particular spot to get to Antarctica in the summer months of Antarctica, because it gets you closer to the South Pole. It means there's less distance to drag their sledges. They did take ponies, they did take dogs, but most of it was going to be dragged, so that's why they went to that particular point. And Amundsen himself, of course, chose that particular area because it was closer to the South Pole, much easier. About 60 miles for Amundsen, I think it was. Yeah, I can't remember how many people get there per year, to be honest. It's in its thousands. It's not as little as you think. It is in its thousands, but I do feel very lucky getting down there. I never thought I would make it down to Antarctica. I thought I'd maybe get down to the peninsula. I thought I could do that at some point through South America and so on, and fly to maybe Argentina or something. But to do the New Zealand trip, right to New Zealand in a boat to Antarctica, the way that I planned, yeah, I feel very lucky to have done that. Very lucky, yes. I did visit New Zealand. I was there in New Zealand for 4 weeks as well, 2 weeks beforehand, 2 weeks afterwards, and that was a fantastic place as well. But Antarctica was the main goal. I was very lucky that a number of the passengers that were on the boat with me were actually relatives of people who'd been with Scott and Shackleton 100 years ago. It was the grandson of a scientist who had been there, and he'd been with Scott and Shackleton 100 years ago, and also there was someone whose father had been to Antarctica with Scott. She was an elderly lady in her 80s, and her father had been with Scott. So she'd heard first-hand stories, or second-hand stories, from the relatives about the things that had gone there. A lot of people think when they know about Scott, they think about it being very tragic, very kind of desolate place. It's desolate in terms of being isolated and remote from the rest of the world. But when you hear about the scientists that have been there, they describe it as the best times of their life. They were young men, they were on the edge of an uncharted continent. Nobody had been to the mountains, nobody knew what lay in the interior of Antarctica. Nobody knew what to find in terms of geology. There could have been diamonds around the corner, or gold seams. There might still be that there now under the ice. But they were actually there as scientists and explorers and adventurers on a brand new world, which was absolutely fantastic. The huts were well stocked. They had fantastic food. They had cooks. They had people who cleaned up. They had dogs, they had ponies around about the hut as well, so there was lots of things going on there. They had activities in the winter months when it was 24 hours darkness. I think they might have had a piano, they had a gramophone and so on. So they had entertainment, they had good food, they had lots to do, they had planning to do for when the summertime did come. So it was a fantastic place to be. I took lots of sketch pads with me. I took lots of paints with me, watercolours and inks. Luckily enough, I'd met another artist who'd been down via the peninsula to Antarctica, and he told me to take lots of blue paint. So I took lots of blue paint with me, sort of cobalt blues, ultramarines and so on, turquoise, and I took extra tubes of paint with me. I was well wrapped up, and I did lots of sketching, I did lots of drawing, I did ink drawings. One of the things I did try and do when it was very cold is I tried to sketch outside the ship. When I was on deck, I would do sketches of the actual landscape, and then for painting I actually had to go inside to the cabin to paint because the waters would have frozen and so on. So it was very cold drawing. One of the things I did have cut off gloves, which which were cut off at the fingers for sketching. I didn't do very detailed drawings, partly because the ship was on the move most of the time. Very rarely were we anchored. One or two drawings like Franklin Island, which will be in the exhibition, and I did prints of it. That's when we were anchored off the island and I was able to do very detailed drawings, but most of the time we were on the move. The other thing was round about the huts, Scott's hut, Shackleton's hut, Borchgrevink's hut. I would have had time to have sat down and done very detailed drawings if I'd wanted to, but because we were there for just a set period of time, I decided to try to do lots of different photographs. I tried to do sketches from different points round about the huts, and I tried to do what we call one-liners, where you don't take the pencil off the paper, and I tried to capture as much as I could in that set period of time. We weren't there all day, it was a set period of time, so I just had to cram as much as I could. I thought if I just sit down and do one drawing, that wouldn't be enough. I was trying to capture the atmosphere and the different viewpoints from round about the hut. Try to capture as much as I could via sketches, coloured watercolours, ink drawings and so on. And the plan was to bring them back and maybe work them up into something. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I did have in the back of mind I was going to turn them into prints. And I joined Edinburgh Printmakers when I came back, and they've been very good to me, and they've been training me up in screen printing, lithography and collagraph printing as well. I'm not an expert in any of these printing techniques, but I've been kind of getting experience and I've been getting better at them, and we try to turn the sketches into these prints and adapting them from the drawings and so on. The other thing there are artefacts still around about the huts. Some of the metal work that's around about the huts have got a nice patina on them. They turn out a lovely turquoise colour. The bronzes and so on. The iron nails and some of the iron work that's around about the hut, of course, has turned this kind of lovely burnt sienna colour. They've turned this lovely, these oxide colours from iron, these beautiful colours, especially when you're surrounded with blues and whites and so on. So when I came back, one of the things that happened is the ship sculptures that I've been making, and some of them are in the exhibition, they started to take on a patina. I started to make them to make them look as though they were bronze and so on, like ancient artefacts, not from just 100 years ago, but from the fact that they could be thousands of years old. So that was one of the things that struck me there when you were down there. There's very little to do with human habitation down there, of course, which is why when you do visit something like the hut, Scott's hut for instance, the texture of the wood, the texture of the fur, the broken linoleum on the floor, everything seems very, very sharp, very, very clear, because everything else, of course, is just ice. So anything that's human made seems to look valuable or interesting, when actually it's just a nail or a plank or an old book or a sleeping bag or something. So everything takes on a kind of an aura of being valuable. When you get to the hut, the huts are all kind of washed out. They have been conserved and certain things have been changed and stuff, just recently been conserved. But that's why when you do find a little bit of red oxide on a piece of iron nail, it's very bright, very colourful, it's very vivid. Or even the one things that was outside Scott's hut was it's just a brass tap that turned this beautiful turquoise colour. And so those little colour shades are quite nice to see when you are surrounded by blues, cobalt blues, dark ultramarine blues. And also little sparks of colour on the penguins as well. The Adelie penguin, most of it's black and white, but when you're close up to it, it's got this beautiful little blue eye, and these little pink feet as well. So any warm colours you see in Antarctica are very striking, like the penguin's feet and so on. And obviously the beautiful golden yellow that's on emperor penguins side of the actual bird itself. So the palette is mainly blues, whites, and greys. Perhaps there are a few umber colours, burnt umbers, and so on and so forth, because of the volcanic nature of the sand. Mount Erebus, which is the volcano that's down there, it's the most southerly volcano in the world. That, of course, over the decades or millennium has been thrown out boulders and sand and so on and so forth. So all around about Ross Island is this beautiful black sand, and further along where the Transantarctic Mountains is, there essentially this kind of iron oxide on the side of it. Shackleton went to Antarctica obviously to get to the South Pole, but he was also hoping to find seams of precious metals and stones and so on. He never came across it. They certainly came across coal, they certainly came across fossils in some exposed areas, but he didn't find his diamonds. and the main explorers of Antarctica to begin with, the 12 major countries, have signed a treaty saying they're not going to exploit Antarctica. They're going to keep it for scientific survey. They're going to try and keep it from exploitation in terms of its wildlife and its minerals. Saying that, of course, the oceans round about Antarctica are still exploited for its fish, for its whales, and I believe there's a possibility that some countries might even be going for the krill, which is the basic, what would you call it now? It's the bottom of the food chain. It's what all other animals eat. Without the krill, everything else would suffer. Mm-hmm. So the idea of Antarctica being left pristine, it'd be fantastic if it could. Like I said, there is the Antarctic Treaty, which is meant to preserve Antarctica for the future, for future generations, but there's no enforcement of it. There's no enforcement of it at all. Any country could decide, in theory, to go down to Antarctica and build a massive hotel. But the only problem with that is because it's such an extreme environment. I'm talking about the weather being benign when I was down there, being beautiful, but most of the time it's an extreme environment. You're talking about minus 50, minus 60, minus 70, possibly more. You're talking about blizzards, you're talking about the katabatic winds that come down from the South Pole itself that travel at 100, 150 miles an hour, which makes human habitation and any kind of work that you're going to do impossible, especially during the winter months. The other thing about Antarctica, if you're thinking of exploiting the actual minerals, is how do you get it out of there? The ice, of course, grows back in the winter time, way beyond the actual Antarctic continent itself, which makes it impossible to get there almost by plane or boat. So you're still fairly remote there, and to make it worth their while financially would take a great deal of investment. I spent all the time training to draw. I spent quite a bit of time trying to get the painting techniques right out, and so that when I went to Antarctica I could jot down and put down my thoughts of what I saw very quickly and efficiently and as accurately as I could. If somebody had told me 4 years ago that the piece that perhaps I'm most proud of just now, and certainly took me on a journey that was slightly different from that I'd ever imagined, is wolf suit. The fact that I'm actually working in fur. That's the strange thing. When I first got a book a book about Scott Ponting's photographs, one of the things that jumped out at me right away, I don't know why, was the gloves that they were wearing. These fantastic big wolfskin gloves. And these gloves were meant to protect their hands when they were fixing their sledges or putting up the tents and so on, because they had another pair of gloves underneath. But they had these big wolfskin mitts. And these wolfskin mitts were attached to lamp wick, which went round their heads and their necks, and just stopped them from blowing away when they took them off. I don't know why those particular items jumped out at me, but they did grab my attention. So I thought, well, I'll have a wee go at making those. So I started looking at different furs that you could use. I started looking at different ways that were sewing, and I started getting involved in looking at Inuit books. Who's obviously live in the Arctic, and they're used to wearing all these kind of they're used to wearing these kind of gloves and so on, and reindeer skins and so forth. So I started looking at fur gloves, and I thought, well, if I'm going to make the fur gloves, what happens if I go a little bit further? Amundsen took reindeer suits with them based on Inuit designs. So I thought, I did order some reindeer fur and I played around with that, but I didn't go down that route. And eventually I thought, I'll try and make a whole suit, but I'll try and make it look like a kind of wolfskin suit. And then it slowly developed, and it took about 2 or 3 years for me to get around to actually making the whole suit. By trial and error, trying to get furs that worked or furs that looked realistic. I think it has achieved that in certain respects. I made most of it myself, the boots, the trousers, the gloves. I found the parka and round about the hood section very difficult though. So I did have some help from Abby, who gave me a hand putting that particular section together, because it's in 3 or 4 pieces, and then the actual fringe around around the actual hood itself. So if anybody asked me that I'd been doing a fursuit 4 years ago and working in fur and faux furs and full size fursuit, I don't think I would have believed them. No, I would have thought I would have come back with some sketches and drawings. I would have made my prints. I could understand that process. I'd kind of thought that one ahead, but not that side of it.